Strangely, the book Lost Omens Firebrands has no material supporting the existing Firebrand's braggart archetype, and even more strangely, I'm perfectly okay with that. Today, I'm going to be talking about the new setting book for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Lost Omens Firebrands, on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who needs another, more established YouTuber to please publicly promote and proclaim the quality of my channel so that I can be promoted to a second Mark member of the Paizoverse. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to another episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide Reviews, where we take a look at different products for tabletop RPGs. In particular today, we're going to be taking a look at Lost Omens Firebrands, which is a setting book for the predominant setting of Pathfinder 2e, Golarion, and in particular this book takes a look at the organization known as the Firebrands. The Firebrands are a very loosely affiliated group of revolutionaries and braggarts whose antics and heroics have managed to bring about some very interesting changes all across the world of Golarion, and this book dives into what this relatively new faction means to the Golarion Campaign Setting. This book comes in at 127 pages, including back matter, and has a retail price of $39.99. Before we dive into the review proper, I should let you know that Paizo actually sent me a review PDF of Lost Omens Firebrands, and I was originally hoping to do this review last month using that PDF, but with some of the news that has taken place in the TTRPG sphere, with things like the OpenRPG Creative License and the announcement of Pathfinder Remastered, this review got pushed back a little bit and my physical copy of Lost Omens Firebrands actually came in. So that's why I'm talking about the physical product here. But I still want you all to know Paizo did send me a review copy of the PDF. Thank you, Paizo, for that. I should also note that Paizo did not in any way script this review or tell me what they expected me to say. These thoughts are my own, and I do hope that they give you some insight into whether or not this product might be right for you. However, having said that, please remember the important grain of salt that I give with any review that I do on this channel, which is the best review you will ever have is to try the product for yourself. I always recommend try before you buy. Maybe check this book out at your fine local gaming store, or possibly borrow it from a friend, or maybe even check out some of the new material that is included over on Archives of Nethys. Examining the product for yourself is always going to give you the best idea of whether or not a product is right for you. And now, to get all of the usual stuff out of the way, really quick, please remember if you enjoy this video, you can support the channel by liking the video, sharing the video, subscribing to the channel, or possibly even checking out my free Discord or my Patreon, both of which are linked in the video description. But with all of that out of the way, let's get started. As a quick FYI, there are a few things I want to note up front about this review. First off, this review will probably be a little shorter than normal. My son has been sick recently, and that's just kind of messed with my filming schedule, and I'm trying to squeeze this video in because, honestly, it's already been put off too long. But if there's anything particular in this video that you want me to come back and cover more in depth, please let me know in the comments, and I will definitely take a look at doing that. The other thing worth mentioning is the format that I use when I review products, because when I do a review, I actually like to begin at the end, give you my overall thoughts on a product, and then kind of work through the product so you can understand how I came to the conclusions that I did. In giving my overall thoughts on a product, I actually give two different grades. One is an initial grade, and then the second is a final grade. The initial grade is kind of a description of what I expect the product to be. Some products, what I would consider an A-tier product, are products that are going to be used very frequently at the gaming table, while other products are much less commonly used, and it's okay, that's their intention, but because they are less utilitarian at the gaming table, I would give them maybe a C tier or a D tier. So I begin with an initial grade, kind of setting the expectations of what I think a product should be, and then I use the final grade to answer the question, did the product meet its expectations, exceed the expectations, or possibly fail to live up to them? Now, strangely, in evaluating this book, I actually had an easier time deciding what the final grade should be than I did deciding what the initial grade should be. And yes, I know that sounds a little strange, but allow me to explain. If I'm being fair to Paizo, the book Lost Omens, Firebrands is probably the definition of a C-tier product. It is focused on a particular organization inside of a particular campaign setting, meaning that if you are running a campaign themed around that organization, it's probably very useful. And if your campaign doesn't involve that organization, it's not going to see play. That's probably what the expected or initial grade of Lost Omens Firebrands should be. But honestly, when I was approaching this product, I was hesitant to even give this product an initial grade of a D. And I'll tell you why. The Firebrands are one of the newest organizations in the Golarion Campaign Setting, and they were introduced in a previous book in the Lost Omens line. In the Lost Omens character guide, it took a look at several major organizations inside of Golarion, such as the Pathfinders, the Magambaya Magic School, and the Hell Knights, and it also introduced this new group called the Firebrands, and I hate to say it, but in Lost Omens character guide, the Firebrand section is easily the weakest section in this book. Maybe it's because they're placed against other more established organizations, or maybe it's just it was early in the life cycle of Pathfinder 2e that the character guide came out, but the Firebrand section just did not appeal to me at the time, and it came across as weak and very unfulfilling. On top of that, the Firebrand braggart dedication that's included in the Lost Omens character guide it's possibly one of the worst archetypes in the game. It's not appealing. So my initial opinion of the Firebrands in Pathfinder 2e was not very good. So when Paizo announced that they were coming out with Lost Omens Firebrands, I was honestly kind of reluctant about this book. And so with the initial grade, I kind of struggled because I felt C is probably the honest initial grade that I should be comparing them to, but D is the initial grade I wanted to give them because my expectations were not high. However, whether an initial grade of a C or a D is more appropriate, I can say that I walked away from this book rather impressed by the quality, and I give Lost Omens Firebrands a final grade of a C+. If the Firebrands got off to a very rough start in their initial introduction to Pathfinder 2e, I've got to say this book does a lot to really sell me on the organization and the storytelling potential that they represent. Let me encourage you to check this book out because I think the authors at Paizo have figured out what they want to do with the Firebrands, and it really comes through in this book a lot more clearly and a lot more effectively. In fact, I would say one of the big strengths of this book is Lost Omens Firebrands has pretty strong writing. The characters are interesting, the story hooks are engaging, and they cover a variety of different types of stories and different places that characters could go. There's a lot of inspiration to be had here, and just the quality of presentation overall is truly very engaging. It's really well done. As for a second strength of Lost Omens Firebrands, the creativity that's found in the writing in this book actually carries over to some of the mechanical options presented in this book as well. I find a lot of the additional mechanical elements to be very interesting and engaging as well. And I'm going to go ahead and say, though there are not a lot of them, the new skill feats in this book are just consistently fun. Skill feats is an aspect of Pathfinder 2e that was starting to get a little bit dry for me, and Lost Omens Firebrands has actually shown me that skill feats still has a lot of creative room left in it, and I'm excited to see what Paizo can do in the future as a result. However, no book is perfect, and I think one of the most obvious weaknesses on this book is going to be, it's a small book. This book is only 127 pages, and that ultimately means that for all of the content that they try to cover, the amount of material presented here is relatively thin. I do think there's a lot of cool, inspiring stuff, and I do think there are a lot of fun ideas, but at the end of the day, the number of options presented are going to be limited, and I do think that's something you want to consider when you're deciding when and if to add Lost Omens Firebrands to your collection. But let's talk about the different chapters in Lost Omens Firebrands so you can know a little bit more about what to expect. Chapter 1 of Lost Omens Firebrands is basically just an introduction to the Firebrands. It is an overview of the organization. Chapter 2 is called Among the Firebrands and is going to present some of the major factions, figures, and faiths inside of the organization. Chapter 3 covers the different character options that Firebrand characters might want to use, and then Chapter 4 is called Firebrand Efforts and represents what different groups of Firebrands are doing around the Inner Sea. Looking at these from a big picture, Chapters 1 and 2 are relatively evenly divided between content that might be appealing to players and content that might be appealing to storytellers. Chapter 3 is obviously player-focused with all of the new cool options it presents, and then Chapter 4 is your more Game Master-focused chapter, giving storytellers an idea of the different events and locations that might be appropriate to Firebrand stories. Let's talk about them individually. Chapter 1, the introduction to the Firebrands, is going to discuss a number of different topics. It starts with a history and timeline of the organization, and then moves on to a discussion of how someone joins the Firebrands, and this, I think, is particularly interesting. The way you join the Firebrands is you literally just start telling people you're a Firebrand. Like, you don't have to pass a test, you don't have to go anywhere, you don't have to do anything in particular. Just start telling people you're a Firebrand, and congratulations, you're a Firebrand. Easiest acceptance ever. Sort of. Firebrands are measured informally through a system of marks, ranging from Mark 1 up to Marks 2, 3, and 4, where Mark 1 is just a self-proclaimed Firebrand, but Mark 2 is where you become an acknowledged Firebrand by someone else who has standing in the organization. Essentially, anyone can say they're a Firebrand, but where you really gain some credibility is when another Firebrand looks at you and says, "That guy's cool enough, I'm going to acknowledge that he deserves the same title that I do." Your third and fourth mark Firebrands are not as sharply defined as the first two marks, but they translate roughly to local renown and then regional renown, and are essentially a measure of how famous that particular Firebrand happens to be. Beyond that, there's a discussion of the different roles that Firebrands might take on. Two large groupings exist, the Revolutionaries and the Glory Hounds, kind of representing whether your character is driving for a particular goal or organization, or whether you're just kind of a braggart who likes the attention. And some of the fun conversation in this chapter actually revolves around how the Revolutionaries, the goal-oriented Firebrands, use the more Glory Hound style Firebrands to their advantage. They talk about the dynamics of these two groups, and it's very interesting and well described. Beyond the Revolutionaries and Glory Hounds, you get 4 more possible roles that Firebrands can have: the Ember, Spark, Blaze, and Flame, which is sort of a rough description of how the Firebrand operates within their given organization. Embers are stealthier firebrands, people who work behind the scenes or under the cover of shadows. Sparks are the sort of firebrands who join communities in an effort to inspire the community to achieve something important. And then blazes often serve as the face of firebrands within a particular area, though it is worth noting that the distinction between a blaze that is truly the face of the organization and a blaze that's just a loud braggart who loves the attention can be a little hard to define sometimes. Finally, there is a role called Flame, which is sort of a mixed bag wild card that can be given to a firebrand if their role in an organization is a little less defined. Along with the discussion of how to join the firebrands, the different marks within the firebrands, and the roles that a character might have, you also get some discussion of the slang terminology that firebrands tend to use, as well as an overview of the different allies and enemies that firebrands as a whole have taken on. If you can't tell from the description so far, the Firebrands organization is very loosely affiliated, meaning a lot of this conversation works in very broad, sometimes vague strokes, and that may have been the problem with the Firebrands back in Lost Omens character guide. Those vague strokes were just too vague to be useful, but here I think Paizo has struck the right balance between painting the picture of what this wild affiliate of characters is, while also giving you some real sense of how to use Firebrands inside of your campaign. Chapter 2 is called Among the Firebrands, and this is kind of a who's who of the Firebrand organization. It starts off with a discussion of different factions within the Firebrands, though when it comes to the Firebrands, you will many times get the sense that a character's particular faction is actually a more important affiliation than their affiliation to the Firebrands as a whole. The Silver Ravens and the Nightwave Pirates may be allied and may look upon one another as fellow Firebrands, but a character's primary identifier is probably going to be as a Nightwave Pirate first, and then as a Firebrand more as a distant second. Still, we get an introduction to several major factions of the Firebrands, such as the aforementioned Nightwave Pirates, as well as several smaller groups, and here Paizo actually plays around with the idea that it's not always clear-cut whether or not a group truly is a member of the Firebrands, or if they're just claiming membership for their own crazy reasons. And a good example of this is the Baffle Guild, a group of people who are leaving crazy puzzles all around Absalom. After the faction section, you get a long list of notable figures, which are basically prominent movers and shakers within the Firebrands as a whole, and I could dive into some of the NPCs that are offered here, but actually my favorite part of this section is a sidebar talking about famous deaths. This was a really interesting conversation, and it kind of centers around the idea sometimes a Firebrand is famous for what they do when they're alive, and sometimes a Firebrand is famous because of how they died. Why does this sound like player characters to a T? But they actually have a pretty good discussion of what a famous and notable death might mean to a campaign, and I thought that was really interesting. After the notable figure section, you then get to move on to a discussion of faiths, and for such a broad organization as the Firebrands, I'm sure you can imagine that faith is a very broad conversation, but you're going to get a discussion of some of the deities that tend to be popular with the Firebrands. And in particular, one of my table's favorite deities is actually highlighted in this book. That's Milani the Everbloom. I pretty much cannot run a campaign without someone wanting to be an adherent of Milani, so it was kind of nice to see them featured in this book. And after the deity section, you get a convenient list of the avatar forms associated with divine spellcasters that serve each of these deities. And then finally, you get a list of different pantheons, all inspired by the various faiths surrounding the Firebrands. A lot of this is world-building stuff, but there are plenty of things that player characters can latch onto, plenty of things that storytellers can latch onto. There is a lot of fun stuff in this chapter, and it certainly makes for some interesting reading. However, far and away the chapter that is probably going to see the most use from this book is Chapter 3, which is Firebrand Options. This is a selection of options for player characters to represent the training that their Firebrand character receives, or equipment that their character has access to, or possibly even services that their character might employ as a result of the missions they go on as a member of the Firebrands. The content covered in this chapter is going to include backgrounds, skill feats, class feats, archetype feats, equipment, magic items, spells, and services. Starting off with backgrounds, you're going to get 5 normal backgrounds and 2 rare backgrounds that you can use for a Firebrand's character. My favorite here is the new Dauntless background. It is a rare background that allows a character to gain a bit of an advantage when they are suffering from the frightened condition. It feels a little bit like a rich kid who fell down a well and got surrounded by bats, if you catch my drift. Next up is a section that has a mixture of skill feats and class feats. There are 5 class feats and 6 skill feats overall. The class feats are spread across a few different classes. Probably the most notable option here is Dazzling Display has returned to Pathfinder 2nd Edition as an option for fighters, swashbucklers, and a couple of other classes in Pathfinder 2e. However, the new skill feats are actually what caught a lot of my attention because a lot of them are just creative and really interesting. An easy example is the new Eyes of the City skill feat that allows you to use diplomacy or society to track people through an urban environment. There are just a lot of interesting ideas here. After this, you get a larger section containing 21 new archetype feats that are all tied to the archetypes from the Advanced Player's Guide. Now, it's a little bit of a grab bag of exactly which archetypes are represented and exactly which options are available to the different archetypes, but essentially what this book does is it takes some of the existing archetypes in Pathfinder 2e and gives you some Firebrand flavor that you can apply if you're playing a character of that particular archetype. And as I said in the teaser to this video, there is a very noticeable gap here, which is the Firebrand braggart from Lost Omens character guide is not represented in this section. All of the archetypes covered here are from the Advanced Player's Guide, nothing else. Now, I actually like this for a couple of reasons. First, if you've seen some of my other videos on the Lost Omens series, I really don't like when Lost Omens books force you to refer back to other Lost Omens books in order to understand the content. If a Lost Omens book is building on the mechanics of Pathfinder 2e, I prefer for it to build on the mainline mechanics and refer back to main source books, or for the content inside of the book to be completely standalone. So, in this case, because Firebrands is only referring back to the Advanced Player's Guide, it meets that criteria for me. However, I think it's also worth noting that old archetype, the Firebrand braggart from Lost Omens character guide, builds on a playstyle that I think just doesn't work very well in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I know what they're going for with the Firebrand braggart, but honestly it feels like a mechanic that just isn't very rewarding in a game like Pathfinder 2e. And I think Paizo made the right move by not trying to make that archetype work. Honestly, the Firebrand flavor being given to the Advanced Player Guide archetypes feels a lot better here and feels like it hits the right tone a lot more accurately. A good example is the Celebrity archetype from the Advanced Player's Guide. That feels like it hits the flavor that the Firebrand braggart is supposed to be going for, but actually nails the mechanics in a more meaningful way. So in this book, you end up with the Celebrity archetype getting a lot of archetype feats that are flavored for the Firebrands, things like the Grudging Compliment reaction, and it feels on brand to what the Firebrand should do, and I think it just flows better inside the game. I think Paizo picked the right focus here, and it might seem strange that existing content in the Lost Omens series was overlooked, but ultimately I think it's for the better of the product. After this, you get a list of equipment, magic items, spells, and services that a Firebrand character might employ, and honestly the takeaway from this chapter is there's a lot of fun stuff for players to look at, and a lot of fun new tricks and toys that they're going to get to use. The final chapter, Chapter 4, is called Firebrand Efforts, and this is clearly the Game Master or Storyteller chapter. It talks about what the Firebrands are doing around the world, around the Inner Sea, and gives you an idea of just different Firebrand stories that you can use if this organization is something you'd like to feature in your game. You're going to get examples of Firebrand events like the Fonter's Carnival, and you're also going to get a look at what the Firebrands are doing in different regions, such as the Mwange Expanse or Galt. Overall, I think the events are probably going to be a little more inspiring than some of the regional sections, but in general the content here is good, it's solid, it's something Game Masters are going to be able to look at and generate a lot of good story ideas from. Honestly, there's not a lot to say about this chapter, but the content is certainly welcome and appreciated. And, well, that's it. Like I said, Lost Omens Firebrands is a pretty short product. You can read through this book pretty quickly, get an idea of the content very easily, and I do think that it's going to inspire a lot of player characters and a lot of storytellers to use the Firebrands in one fashion or another in their games. Overall, this is probably not a book that you're going to add to your Pathfinder collection early on, but as your collection begins to grow, this is a product that I think you will eventually be interested in adding. Especially for storytellers, the way this book is presented, the quality of the writing, I think there's a lot of inspiration to be found here, and I think there's a rich selection of ideas for things that you can add to your games, and I think there will be many occasions where, especially storytellers, will want to pass this book to their players and say, hey, would you be interested in some of this content? I certainly think there's a lot of fun ideas, and I imagine there's going to be a lot of players who are interested in some of the options presented. But those are my thoughts. The time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about Lost Omens Firebrands, and do you agree with my assessment? Are there strengths of this product that I have overlooked, or are there weaknesses that I failed to mention? Jump down to the comments section and let me know what you think, and if you have any questions about this product where you would like me to dive a little bit deeper into it, please let me know that as well. As always, my favorite part of this job is getting to hear from you, so I'm excited to hear what you think. Don't forget all of that other YouTube stuff. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.